So we want to start, obviously, with this announcement that's just come out of the White House about how they're going to approach this question of investment from China, and particularly with technology. And the president said he's not going to specifically target China. He's not going to go over under that IEPA, that Emergency Powers Act. He's going to expand CFIUS, provided you give him the powers to do so. Did he make the right decision?
I think so. I think the changes in CFIUS are needed just to update it, particularly as to new technologies and new kinds of investments that might have national security implications. So I think what he's referring to is legislation that we're working on in the Senate. It's typically called FIRMA, but it has to do with CFIUS reform. As compared to going down another road, I think it's 301 that he was considering with regard to investments from China. So look, I think on all these issues, David, we want to have a level playing field. We want to have reciprocity as between the United States and China. There's a big gap there on reciprocity as to how investments are treated, as you know. In other words, U.S. firms are not able to make the same kinds of investments in China. Often they have to have a Chinese partner, often 51%. But with regard to this decision, yeah, it's correct to assume that countries in the world will be treated the same way under the traditional approach, which is MFN, most favored nation, meaning every country is treated the same, but we do apply our laws and enforce the laws.
In his statement, the president actually specifically referred to Section 301, and he said that if we don't get the expanded CFIUS, then he might well come back and do it a different way. How likely is it, and when it might occur, that you would enact the revised CFIUS?
In the Senate, I think the prospects are very good to enact the updated CFIUS, and I say that because it's bipartisan. I think both sides of the aisle agree we have to modernize and update it. In the House, there's been less of a consensus around it up to this point, but I think if you get a strong vote in the Senate, it's very likely you get a vote in the House also.
And what about this issue about the extent to which Congress, Senate, and the House of Representatives for that matter, but the Senate specifically where you reside, should have a say in trade relations? In putting this under CFIUS, I want to remind our audience that is Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States, which is administered really by the Treasury Department. How concerned are you that it really puts it entirely within the discretion of the the executive branch?
Well, we'll see what comes out. The CFIUS is a screen on investments. In other words, if a company wants to invest in a national security asset in the United States, that the CFIUS group, which is represented by an interagency group, would be able to block that investment. It happens rarely, but it happens with regard to things like investments in very sensitive telecommunications or defense industries, that sort of thing. I think it's very likely that there will be something in there that pulls it back to Congress at some point, or narrows the executive prerogative in CFIUS a little bit. But for the most part, these are decisions that have to be made quickly. They're decisions that have to be made on an interagency basis. I think that will continue.
The president is focused obviously on technology with regard to China quite specifically, but it certainly is not just investment in the United States. There's also the intellectual property proceeding, the Section 301 proceeding that has to do with U.S. companies having to share their intellectual property, perhaps theft as it's been called, by China, and that's a bigger issue. Are you satisfied that we're taking the right approach to that? Because as I understand it, we have a lot of allies like in Europe, for example, who would be on our side, but we may have alienated with some of these tariffs we put on steel and aluminum.
Well, yeah, that's another issue. I think with regard to intellectual property in China, I think there is a global consensus that something needs to be done. And as you know, administration after administration since the PNTR, since China came into the World Trade Organization, has tried to get China to live by the rules, really, that a mature trading partner should, which China is. So I think there's a lot of sympathy for what we're doing, and I hope there'll be some help from the EU and from Japan and from other countries who are concerned about China, as you say, theft of IP. That could be movies, it could be music, but also taking manufacturing processes and so on, sort of leapfrogging technology. So I think there's a lot of support for that. But you're right with regard to the EU, Canada, and Mexico. There's a separate issue going on, which is the 232 case on steel and aluminum. And there are concerns about that. As you know, those countries are threatening to impose tariffs on U.S. products now in retaliation for us imposing a 25% tariff on their steel and a lower tariff on their aluminum.
And my question is, are they separate issues? You said that those are separate issues, but we had, for example, the ambassador from the EU to the United States who said that they would love to work with us on the intellectual property issues in China, but we have these tariffs that are really getting in the way. Do you think they truly are separate? I mean, as I say, you were U.S. trade representative. You've had these negotiations before.
Well, they'll do what's in their best interest, and I think it's in their best interest to deal with intellectual property concerns, challenges with China, so I assume they'll want to do that. With regard to the steel tariffs, of course, our hope is that this can get resolved. In other words, this is again about looking for that level playing field, looking for more reciprocity, specifically on issues, for instance, with automobiles. There's a tariff on cars going from the United States to the EU that is 5 times as high as the tariff on cars going from the EU to the United States. And so those are the kinds of issues that do need to be resolved. And the Europeans recently have indicated some interest in looking at that, particularly the Germans have. So I think there's hopefully going to be a resolution of those issues, and that those 232 tariffs will in the end not be imposed, but there'll be a negotiation on some of the other trade disputes.
And those may get resolved, but what about the larger question about the way that Section 232 is used? I mean, do you feel comfortable with a straight face saying to Canada that you're really a national security risk? I mean, there's legislation, as you know well, that your colleague, Mr. Corker and Mr. Toomey are backing right now, saying that actually we should curtail to some extent the president's ability to invoke national security with respect to allies like Canada and Europe.
Yeah, as you know, I'm concerned about the misuse of 232, and we had a hearing last week where Secretary of Commerce came up to talk to us about it, and I expressed that concern as I have in other settings. But my concern is that it is a national security tool, ought to be used very rarely and appropriately for that purpose, and that this case of using 232 in certain instances is not appropriate. I do think with regard to steel, it is a national security concern, but you need to target it as to product and as to country. And if it's not surgical and very targeted, then it is a misuse of the 232 tool, which, by the way, will lead to one of two things. Either we'll use 232 inappropriately, then there'll be a case against us in the World Trade Organization. We may lose that and then lose the ability to use 232. There is Article 21 of the World Trade Organization and the GATT before it that allows you to use it, but only on these narrow national security areas. So that could happen. The second thing that could happen is other countries will say, great, we'll do the same thing and just raise tariffs on U.S. products, not for national security concerns, but just because you can do it without having to prove, as you would in other trade cases, that there is dumping or selling it below your costs, or that there is subsidization, which is when we put countervailing duty tariffs on, or that there is a surge, or that there is material injury. These are all things that have to be proven otherwise. So I'm concerned about the use of it. We shouldn't be using it too broadly, because it could come back to hurt our farmers, our manufacturing workers in my home state of Ohio and other places around the country.